Hi and welcome back. First things first, sorry for my short hiatus. I moved a couple of weeks ago and needed some time to get settled in, which I mostly am now. I don't anticipate taking any more breaks over the next few months and have a lot of videos planned out with some really interesting topics, starting with this entire month of videos. In honor of Black History Month, I wanted to talk about some lesser known events or some really amazing people that, as an American, I don't remember ever learning about in school. The extent of learning Black history was usually consolidated in only Black History Month and was usually something along the lines of slavery long time but bad, Lincoln equals savior, MLK Jr. big peaceful role model, all good now. I've learned so much over the last few years and thought I'd share some of that with you guys, starting with today's video on Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre. You can probably guess why we were never taught about it in school here in America. At least I wasn't, and a resounding number of people that I know weren't either. So Black Wall Street was located in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The area was founded in 1906 when former slaves of the Native Americans who owned the land acquired allotted land in the area. Between 1865 and 1920, there were actually more than 50 black townships throughout the state. The 40 acres that would become Greenwood were purchased by a wealthy black landowner by the name of O.W. Gurley. He wanted to create something for black people by black people. He had the first black-owned business as of 1906 and set up a system where if someone wanted to own a business, they could get help to do so. On Greenwood Avenue, aka Black Wall Street, there were shops, restaurants, grocery stores, jewelry stores, clothing stores, theaters, a barber shop, a library, entertainment, and offices for doctors, dentists, and even lawyers. The city was designed to be a self-contained community for black people, and that it was. Aside from the booming businesses, they had their own school system, post office, bank, hospital, and bus and taxi service. The city even had the largest black-owned hotel in the country. An ordinance was passed on August 4th, 1916 that officially mandated residential segregation. Segregation was treated as the law of the land, as it were, and this self-contained community was fine with it. They were thriving. So now let's talk about the overall climate of the U.S. at the time. Things were made worse in general by the fact that the Ku Klux Klan was revived and continuing to grow rapidly, in large part due to the release of The Birth of a Nation in 1915. Birth of a Nation was a hugely racist film full of racist ideas and stereotypes, which made the KKK out to be the heroes by the end of it. Racial tensions were always high, but especially leading up to this particular devastating event. After all, slavery was not that far removed in the minds of the people, as it had only been outlawed with the 13th Amendment in 1865. African Americans still had very few rights and were still seen as inferior by white Americans. They still had no time to build generational wealth and had very few opportunities to own land or get into a professional field. Segregation was still in full force at this time, and not just the segregation of neighborhoods, but everything. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson initiated the segregation of workplaces, restrooms, and lunchrooms in all federal offices on April 11, 1913. Because of the racial tensions throughout the country, this wasn't the first race riot of its kind. A few years prior to the event, between July 1st and July 3rd, 1917, the East St. Louis race riot ended up killing 40, injuring hundreds, and forcing some 6,000 people from their homes. Another occurred July 25th through 28th of 1918 in Chester, Pennsylvania, that ended up killing 5 people. At the same time, another 4 people died in a Philadelphia race riot July 26th through 29th of the same year. The Tulsa Race Massacre was in 1921, and thus only a few short years after World War I ended in 1918, so tensions were high with everyone, but especially with 370,000 African Americans who had enlisted, fought, and then came home to be treated just as badly as before. In fact, at this point in 1919, the KKK was operating in 27 states, and 83 lynchings had occurred in this year alone, including several returning soldiers who were still in uniform. The summer of 1919 actually became known as the Red Summer due to the 25 race riots that broke out across the country. I could go on and on about the restrictions and struggles faced by Black Americans during this time, but I think you get the general idea. Back to Greenwood in 1921. Again, Black Wall Street was thriving. Naturally, the white Americans, on the literal other side of the railroad tracks that divided the city, were upset by the growth and the prosperity of Black Wall Street and the Black community. Things finally boiled over on May 30th, 1921. So, on May 30th, a 19-year-old black shoeshiner by the name of Dick Rowland entered the one and only elevator of the Drexel building. He was making his way to the one and only restroom he, as a black man, was allowed to use, and that was the restroom that was on the top floor of that building. That elevator was being operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. He was accused of sexual assault by a bystander who heard Sarah Page scream and then saw Dick Rowland run from the elevator. When the police conducted their brief investigation, it said that Sarah Page told them that Dick had done nothing more than grab her arm and that she wouldn't be pressing charges. It's speculated that he might have tripped and then grabbed her arm to catch himself, and that was all. Either way, the white people of the town weren't hearing any of it. Rowland was arrested and taken into custody the morning of May 31st, and it didn't take long until one of the white-owned papers, the Tulsa Tribune, broke the story that he had tried to assault her, and then news of a potential lynching spread through the town like wildfire. An armed and angry white mob showed up to the courthouse demanding that Rowland be handed over to them, but the sheriff refused. When hearing about the potential lynching, a group of armed black men also made their way to the courthouse in an attempt to protect Rowland. There were about 100 black men and 1,500 white people. The group of black men retreated to Greenwood after shots were fired. The entire ordeal had just infuriated the white people even further. So shortly before dawn on June 1st, 1921, thousands of angry white people had descended upon Greenwood and let loose once daybreak came. Over the next 24 hours, these angry mobs of white people looted and set fire to everything they could in Greenwood. African American homes and businesses were destroyed, and African Americans were shot on sight. One such fatality was of a black surgeon by the name of A.C. Jackson, who was shot despite surrendering to a group of whites. Reports at the time put the death toll at 36, but historians now estimate the number of fatalities to actually be closer to 300. In addition to the deaths and many injuries, 35 city blocks were left in ruins, thus ending Black Wall Street as they knew it. Fortunately, the black community was stronger than anyone could have known and began rebuilding their city immediately despite no help from Tulsa. They were aided by the NAACP, other black townships in the state, and donations from black churches. The resiliency of the community members themselves is something to be admired. By the end of 1922, 80 businesses had been rebuilt in the area. While Greenwood was rebuilt by the 1940s, it didn't gain quite the level of prominence due to integration. In 1996, an official race riot commission was organized, and in 2001, it was determined that the events of the massacre were in fact historical record and were not rumor or anything like that. In their final report, it was recommended that full reparations should be provided to survivors and their descendants, although this was never done. The 1921 Tulsa Race Riot Reconciliation Act was signed into law on June 1, 2001, and included scholarships for descendants affected, a memorial in honor of those who were killed, and economic development in Greenwood. It did not include reparations, as was suggested by the commission, because the Oklahoma state legislature decided it was not appropriate. Lawsuits calling for reparations have been filed as recently as September 2020 by a 105-year-old survivor of the massacre. This year marks the 100th anniversary of this terrible event. The significance of Black Wall Street and its destruction cannot be understated and is something that should really be talked about in schools. It goes against the traditional viewpoint provided and shows that black people and black communities could be successful, but due to racist ideas and actions, they were not able to prosper for long, if at all. This event was not the first spurned by an idea of racial superiority in America, and it definitely wasn't the last. America in general needs to be better about teaching events as they actually happened and not shoving them under the rug because they don't cast the best light. As I mentioned in the beginning, I didn't learn about this and a few other events that I'll talk about over the next few weeks until probably a few years ago. I am 27, open-minded, and love learning, but these are things that are just generally not as talked about as they should be. Learning about this and other people and events and perspectives growing up allows people to gain empathy for what they themselves don't experience, and it just gives a broader understanding of the world in general. Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I hope you learned something new today. I'll see you next time.